The HOA president thinks she's in control, but in trying to push me out, she's oblivious to the fact that she's the one teetering on the edge of collapse. I, Darius Jackson, had always dreamed of living in a quiet yet luxurious apartment complex in Charlotte. After years of grinding away in Raleigh, I finally made it happen. I rented a unit at Silverstone Towers, a high-end building right in the heart of downtown. But from day one, something felt off. Before diving into the story, comment where you're watching from and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the latest video. I moved in with a truck full of stacked cardboard boxes lining the hallway. As I wheeled my beloved bike into the corner of the room, I caught the eyes. Not from the windows but from the hallway, people standing there, peering at me through the crack of the door, watching from a distance. They didn't approach. No welcome to the building or friendly handshake. Just silence. I saw them linger, staring longer than normal, then quietly slip away. At first I brushed it off. Maybe people here just like their space, I thought. Maybe they'll warm up once they get to know me. But deep down I knew something wasn't right. As I unpacked the first box, arranging a few books on the shelf, a memory hit me. My mom once told me about Eleanor Grayson, a distant relative I'd never met. She said, Eleanor was wealthy, kept to herself, owned a few properties in Charlotte. I remembered her mentioning something about Silverstone Towers, but I never paid it much mind. Just old family stories, I told myself, chuckling. I figured the stress of moving was making me dredge up random stuff, but the feeling of being watched didn't fade. When I stepped onto the balcony for some air, I spotted a figure standing in the hallway near the apartment across from mine. They didn't knock, didn't speak, just stood there staring at me. I shrugged, trying to convince myself it was just cautious neighbors in a new place. Maybe they'll warm up over time, I thought. I shut the balcony door, turned back to my boxes, but a flicker of unease lingered. The next morning I woke to sunlight streaming through the balcony window, still buzzing with excitement. I just brewed my first cup of coffee in the new place, the rich aroma filling the room, when a sharp knock sounded at the door. I set the mug down, thinking it might be the building manager checking something or maybe a neighbor finally coming to say hi. I opened the door, smile still on my face, but the person standing there wasn't welcoming. She looked to be in her 60s, stiff as if she'd just stepped out of an important meeting. She wore a neatly pressed beige blouse, small pearl earrings, and a little pin on her sweater that read Silverstone Towers HOA. I tried to catch the name on it, Margaret Hensley, before she spoke. She stood there, clutching a thick stack of clipped papers, her gaze not exactly cold but carrying something I couldn't quite place. Good morning, she said, her tone clipped, devoid of warmth. I'm Margaret Hensley, president of the Silverstone Towers Homeowners Association. I extended my hand, still aiming for friendly. Nice to meet you. I'm Darius Jackson, I said, hoping to break the weird tension. But she didn't shake my hand, just glanced past me into the apartment like she was inspecting what I'd done with it. I know who you are, she cut in, her voice even but sharp. I'm here to go over a few things. She handed me the stack of papers, and I skimmed it quickly. HOA rules. I saw the usual stuff. No bright curtains, no shoes left in the wrong spot outside, no bikes in the elevator. All things I'd read when I signed the lease. I nodded, about to say something, but Margaret spoke first. We like to maintain a certain standard here, she said, her eyes landing on the bike in the corner. I raised an eyebrow. I get it, I replied, keeping my tone light. I'll keep things tidy. She nodded, but not in a satisfied way, more like she was filing it away to check later. Good, she said, and by the way, per HOA rules, trash needs to go down to the lobby on time, not sit outside your door too long. I saw your bag in the hallway last night. I frowned, a little caught off guard. I haven't taken any trash out, I said, still calm. Must have been left by the previous tenant. Margaret pursed her lips, the thin line curling slightly like she didn't buy it. I see, she said, but her tone screamed she didn't. Either way, be more careful in the future. We have rules for a reason. Then she turned and walked off. No more words, leaving me standing there with the papers and a growing unease. I shut the door, letting out a slow breath. Maybe she's just a perfectionist, I told myself. I'd heard HOAs could be overbearing sometimes, especially in upscale places like Silverstone Towers. I wasn't about to let a prickly neighbor ruin my excitement. I set the papers on the table, promising myself I'd read them later, and started wondering if I was really as welcome here as I'd hoped. But then, one morning, as I went downstairs to check the mail, I found a white envelope slipped under my door. I opened it, a notice from the HOA stating my bike had violated regulations by being brought through the elevator. I frowned, recalling Margaret's words. I'd kept it tucked in the corner, out of anyone's way. So what was the issue? I shrugged, figuring it was just a minor reminder, and went about my day. But the next day, another notice appeared. My TV last night was a bit loud, possibly disturbing neighbors. I laughed. I'd watched a comedy episode at a volume just loud enough to hear, no intention of turning my place into a theater. Then the day after, another letter. I'd left a trash bag outside my door, too long before taking it downstairs. I shook my head, wondering if Margaret had cameras in the hallway. I started looking around, and sure enough, no one else in the building seemed to get these notes. I saw a guy downstairs with an old plastic chair on his balcony, another with a trash bag outside all day, no sign of any notices. I walked through the hallway, down to the lobby, and out to the pool area. I saw other residents, milling about, a few walking dogs, but no one greeted me. No smiles, no nods, just quick glances before they looked away, like I wasn't there. I told myself, they might just be shy with newcomers, but the way they avoided eye contact gnawed at me. As I passed a group, chatting near the elevator, they went silent. One woman, forcing an awkward smile, but no one spoke. I felt watched, not like a neighbor, but like an outsider. On my way back to the apartment, I ran into Talia Brooks, a girl around my age from the floor below. She was carrying a grocery bag, and when I helped lift it from her hands, she smiled. The first smile I'd gotten since moving in. "Thanks," she said, her voice soft. "You're the new guy on 12, right?" I nodded, introduced myself, and we chatted for a few minutes. When I mentioned the HOA letters, Talia raised an eyebrow. "Let me guess, Margaret Hensley, right?" she asked. I nodded and she sighed. "She's infamous here. She once drove a tenant out, just for hanging red curtains, said it ruined the building's aesthetic." I laughed, but inside, a weight settled in. "So she does this to all the newbies?" I asked. Talia shook her head. "Not exactly, just the ones she doesn't like from the start. Be careful. Margaret doesn't let go easily." She left after wishing me luck, leaving me standing there with a swirl of thoughts. I went back to my apartment, sank onto the couch, and stared at the growing stack of notices on the table. After talking to Talia, I started paying closer attention to what was happening around me. I still tried to stay positive, keeping the apartment neat and settling into my new routine. But the HOA letters kept coming. They arrived like clockwork, one a day, each pointing out a new violation I hadn't seen coming. One day I got a notice that my window blinds were too bright, even though I'd used plain white ones like other units. The next day, they said my running shoes were outside the door in the wrong spot, off the mat by a few centimeters. I tried to stay calm, telling myself that following the rules might make it stop. But then one day, after getting home from work, another letter was waiting under the door. This time, it wasn't a petty warning. It was an official notice from the HOA demanding I explain disruptive behavior and ensure compliance with community standards. I read it over and over, trying to figure out what disruptive behavior meant. I hadn't thrown parties, blasted music, or even had anyone over. I frowned, frustration bubbling up, and decided I wasn't letting this slide. I took the letter downstairs to the lobby to find Henry Caldwell, the building manager. He was a middle-aged guy with salt and pepper hair, usually sitting behind the front desk with a bored look. When I slapped the letter on the counter and asked, "Can you explain this?" he peered at me over his glasses and sighed. "That's from the HOA, he said, his voice flat. "I just follow orders." I raised an eyebrow. "But why am I the only one getting these? I see people leaving stuff on balconies, trash outside doors. No one says a thing." Caldwell hesitated, scratching his head, then said, "Look, just comply and save yourself the hassle. Margaret, she's strict about standards here." I smirked, not hiding my irritation. "Strict with me, you mean?" He didn't answer, just looked down at his papers, clearly not wanting to get involved. I went back to my apartment, clutching the letter, my mind racing. Talia's words echoed. Margaret wasn't just tough, she was targeting me. I started to realize this wasn't about blinds or shoes anymore. Something deeper was at play, and I couldn't shake the feeling she wanted me gone. That night, I sat on the couch, staring at the pile of notices on the table. I wondered if I should push back. I didn't want to turn this place into a battlefield. I'd come here for peace, not to feud with a cranky neighbor. But then I heard footsteps in the hallway, slow and deliberate. I got up, peeked through the peephole, and saw Margaret standing there, clipboard in hand, her eyes scanning my door like she was taking notes. She didn't knock, didn't say a word, just stood there for a moment before walking away. My heart beat faster, not from fear, but from the realization she wasn't stopping. The letters, the stares, now the lurking. I tried to stay cool. Maybe she does this to all the new people, I thought. Maybe if I play along she'll get bored and leave me alone. That first meeting, the constant notices, the way she looked at me, it all pointed to one thing. Margaret Hensley didn't want me at Silverstone Towers. The pressure from Margaret Hensley didn't let up in the days that followed. The HOA letters kept sliding under my door, each one flagging a new violation from a small plant on my balcony, deemed non-compliant to me, accidentally leaving my door cracked open for a few minutes while accepting a delivery. I started feeling like I was living under a microscope, every tiny move scrutinized, but I told myself I couldn't let her ruin the new life I'd worked so hard to build. One evening, after a long day at work, I was on the couch, eyeing the stack of notices on the table. I was about to get up and make some tea when my phone rang. I frowned, not recognizing the number, but picked up anyway. "Hello, Darius Jackson speaking," I said. The voice on the other end was low and clear. "Hi Darius, this is Marcus Rivera, an attorney with Rivera and Associates. I'm calling about an important matter regarding Eleanor Grayson's estate." I froze for a second. Eleanor Grayson sounded familiar, but I wasn't sure I'd heard right. "Eleanor?" I asked, my voice wavering. Marcus chuckled lightly. "Yes, she was a distant relative of yours, passed away recently. I've been tasked with contacting you because you're the heir to her estate." I dropped back onto the couch, my head spinning. "Heir? What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Marcus explained that Eleanor Grayson was a discreet real estate investor who owned several properties in Charlotte, including a big chunk of Silverstone Towers. "She left you ownership of a few units here," he said, including apartment 1801, the largest one on the 18th floor, currently rented by a woman named Margaret Hensley. My heart pounded. I stammered. "Margaret Hensley, the HOA president," Marcus confirmed, his tone even. "That's her. Her lease is up soon, and you get to decide whether to renew it or not." I hung up, my mind still reeling from what I'd just heard. Margaret, the woman who'd been making my life hell for weeks, was living in an apartment I owned. I stood up, digging through the unpacked boxes from moving day, hoping to find anything tied to Eleanor. Finally, in the corner of an old box, I found a dusty little wooden case. Inside were some black and white photos, a notebook, and a folded sheet. Eleanor Grayson's will. I skimmed it, and there it was in clear print. Darius Jackson, grandnephew, to inherit properties at Silverstone Towers, including apartment 1801. I picked up a photo, seeing an older woman with a kind smile standing in front of this building when it was brand new. I remembered my mom's stories about Eleanor, and now it all clicked. I called Marcus back, asking for more details. He confirmed I didn't just own Margaret's unit. I also held a 30% stake in Silverstone Towers, enough to have a say in every HOA decision. "Hensley's lease expires in 2 weeks, Marcus said. What do you want to do with it?" I smirked, feeling in control for the first time. "I'll think about it," I replied, but a plan was already taking shape in my head. I sat back on the couch, holding the will, a mix of relief and excitement washing over me. Margaret thought she could drive me out, but she had no idea I wasn't just a tenant. I was the owner of the very place she called home. After the call with Marcus and the discovery about Eleanor, I felt like I'd just found the key to escaping Margaret Hensley's pressure, but I couldn't reveal it yet. I needed time to understand everything and prepare. Meanwhile, the HOA letters kept coming. One day, I got a notice saying my balcony plant's pot was not the regulation size. I laughed, staring at the tiny thing barely big enough for a cactus, wondering if Margaret measured it by the centimeter. But the amusement faded fast when I realized she wasn't stopping. Not until I left Silverstone Towers. I had an idea. Test if Margaret was really fair or just targeting me. I started observing the building more closely. One early morning, I walked the floors, phone in hand, snapping pictures of what I saw. On the 10th floor, someone had an old plastic chair on their balcony, one leg broken. On 14, a trash bag sat outside a door since yesterday, lid off, a faint smell wafting into the hall. On 16, someone hung bright red curtains, the kind Margaret had called an aesthetic ruin. I took over a dozen photos, but saw no sign of warning letters under their doors. I went back to my apartment, opened my laptop and drafted an email to the Silverstone Towers HOA board. "Dear HOA," I wrote, "I'd like to know why my plant is an issue when these violations go unnoticed." I attached the photos and hit send, waiting to see how they'd respond. No reply came. I wasn't too shocked, but it only fueled my resolve. 2 days later, coming home from work, I found Margaret standing outside my door. She didn't knock, just stood there, clipboard in hand, her icy gaze flicking to the shoes I'd left on the mat. I opened the door, leaned against the frame, and asked, "Something I can help you with?" She didn't answer right away, just peered inside like she was checking for hidden contraband. Then she held up a sheet of paper. "This is an official request," she said, her voice syrupy but sharp. "We need you to submit your lease agreement so we can verify your residency status." I smirked, not hiding my disbelief. "You're kidding, right?" I asked. Margaret didn't flinch, her stare hardening. "Some residents are concerned," she went on, "about someone potentially unqualified living here. We've noticed you moving things at odd hours, bringing a bike through the elevator. Some suspect you might not legally rent this unit." I took a deep breath, keeping my tone steady. "First, I rent this place legally. Second, I've been here less than a month. Moving stuff in is normal. The bike, I don't see any rule against it." Margaret pursed her lips, her grip tightening on the clipboard. "We have a policy of verifying all residents," she said, but I cut her off. "Really? So have you asked for anyone else's lease?" She didn't answer, just stared at me. I tilted my head and pressed. "Or is it just me?" Margaret's lips twitched into a smile devoid of warmth. "If you don't submit it, I'll have to report this to the board," she said. I nodded slowly, swallowing the words I wanted to let fly. "I'll think about it," I replied, then shut the door before she could say more. When confronting Margaret outside my apartment, I knew she wouldn't stop at empty threats. I'd emailed Marcus to check the paperwork on Unit 1801, and while awaiting his reply, I tried to keep things normal, going to work, organizing the apartment, and not letting Margaret see me rattled. I had a hunch she was gearing up for a bigger move. I wasn't wrong. One morning just after brewing coffee, I got an email from the HOA titled, "Notice of Severe Violation." I opened it, and the first line stunned me. "Request to terminate residency at Silverstone Towers due to repeated violations and behavior inconsistent with community standards." I read on, trying to stay calm. It listed the usual violations I'd grown familiar with: bike in the elevator, 2 bright blinds, wrong-sized plant pot, but this time a new accusation, disrupting order by lodging baseless complaints with the HOA. I frowned, realizing they meant the email I'd sent with photos of other residents' violations. I smirked, unable to believe Margaret dared twist my questioning her into grounds for eviction. The letter ended with a demand to vacate within 7 days, or legal measures would follow. I set the coffee down, anger rising, but I told myself to keep a clear head. I decided this wouldn't slide quietly. I took the letter downstairs to the lobby to confront Henry Caldwell again. He was behind the desk, flipping through a ledger like nothing was amiss. I slapped the letter in front of him and asked, "What is this?" Caldwell glanced at it, sighed, and pushed his glasses up his forehead. "I didn't write this, Darius," he said, his voice tinged with fatigue. "It's from Margaret and the board. They say you're not cooperating." I tilted my head. "Not cooperating? I just asked why I'm targeted when others aren't. Now she wants me out because I spoke up." Caldwell shrugged, clearly avoiding a fight. "Look, I just follow orders. Margaret says you're causing trouble, and the board agreed. I've got no say here." I took a deep breath, keeping my tone steady. "So has she asked anyone else for their lease, or just me?" He hesitated, then said, "I don't know, but you should talk to her directly." I nodded, turned away, but inside, I resolved that Margaret wouldn't win this easily. That evening, as I sat on the couch reviewing Marcus's email, he just sent me Margaret's lease and confirmation of my ownership of 1801. I heard footsteps in the hallway. I peeked through the peephole, and sure enough, there was Margaret. This time, she wasn't alone. Henry Caldwell was with her, holding a stack of papers, looking uneasy. I opened the door before she could knock, leaned against the frame, and asked, "What's it this time?" Margaret didn't beat around the bush. She held up a sheet, and said sharply, "This is your final notice. You have 7 days to leave Silverstone Towers, or we'll take this to court." I looked at her, then at Caldwell, who avoided my gaze. "Based on what?" I asked. Margaret smiled, but it was cold. "Based on your refusal to submit your lease and repeated violations. Residents here don't want someone like you ruining our standards." I laughed out loud, unable to hold it in. "Someone like me? What's that mean?" Margaret pursed her lips, her grip tightening on the papers. "You know what I mean," she replied. "If you don't leave, I'll report this to the board and request legal action." I took a breath, meeting her eyes. "You do what you have to," I said, my voice calm, but firm. "So will I." I shut the door, hearing their footsteps fade, my heart pounding in my chest. I sat down, phone in hand, and texted Marcus. "Margaret just threatened to evict me. I need all the paperwork ready. I'm settling this at the HOA meeting." Marcus had sent me everything. Eleanor's will, ownership of 1801, and confirmation of my 30% stake in Silverstone Towers. I kept them in a black folder, carrying it like an ace up my sleeve, waiting for the right moment to play it. I didn't tell anyone, not even Talia, because I wanted Margaret to dig her own grave before I turned the tables. An emergency meeting was set for one evening in the first-floor conference room, and I walked in feeling both nervous and confident. The room was packed. Residents filled the chairs, whispering to each other, curious eyes turning to me as I entered. Margaret sat at the head of the long table, composed, holding a stack of papers, flanked by Henry Caldwell and a few other board members. I took a seat near the back, set my folder down, and watched. Margaret tapped the table lightly, drawing everyone's attention. "We're here today," she began, her voice low and sharp, "to address an issue with the resident of Unit 1204, Darius Jackson. Due to numerous violations and community concerns, we propose terminating his residency at Silverstone Towers." I sat still, listening, as she rattled off my offenses: the bike, the blinds, the plant, and the so-called disruption from my complaint email. A few residents nodded, but I saw Talia in the corner, shaking her head slightly. Margaret finished by holding up the eviction notice. "We've given him chances to correct this," she said, "but he refuses to cooperate. I motioned for the board to vote him out." She looked around, clearly expecting quick agreement. I cleared my throat, stood up, folder in hand. "I'd like to say something," I said, my voice calm but loud enough to cut through the murmurs. Margaret pursed her lips, her gaze hardening. "You'll have a chance to respond after she started, but I interrupted. "No," I said, stepping forward. "I'm speaking now." The whispers grew, a few people leaning forward, intrigued. Margaret stiffened but finally nodded, gesturing for me to go on. I opened the folder, pulling out the first sheet. "This," I held it up, "is my lease for Unit 1204, legal, and fully signed. I'm not some intruder like Mrs. Hensley wants you to think." I set it down, took out the second sheet. "This is Eleanor Grayson's will, my relative, proving I inherited multiple properties in Silverstone Towers." I paused, letting it sink in, then held up the last one. "And this is the deed to Unit 1801, where Margaret Hensley lives. I'm her landlord, and she had no idea." The room went dead silent. Margaret opened her mouth, but couldn't speak. Her face paled, her hands trembling on the table. I looked right at her, and continued. "You say I'm not fit to live here, but you're renting from me. Your lease is up soon, and I can choose not to renew. So who really doesn't belong?" A few chuckles broke out in the crowd, cutting the tension. Talia smiled, while Caldwell ducked his head, visibly awkward. Margaret found her voice, but it shook. How did you get that?" she asked, barely above a whisper. I shrugged. "You should have checked the HOA records better, Margaret. Eleanor Grayson passed away, left me her estate, and I confirmed it with my lawyer. Unit 1801 was mine, before you started this eviction game." I turned to the board. "By the way, Mrs. Hensley owes over $4,000 in HOA fees for that unit. She can't pay, but I can reclaim it." The murmurs in the room swelled. An older man at the back, Peterson, a longtime resident, muttered, "Unbelievable. She tried to kick out her own landlord?" Margaret slammed her hand on the table, trying to regain control. "This is slander," she shouted. "I've done everything for this community's good." But I cut her off. "Good? You've targeted me since day one, while ignoring others' violations. I've got photos, broken chairs, red curtains, trash by doors. So why am I the only one fined?" Caldwell cleared his throat, attempting to mediate. "I think we should," but I stopped him. "No, Henry. This isn't about rules. It's about her wanting me gone, because she doesn't like me." I scanned the room, seeing some heads bow, others nod. Margaret huffed, her face flushed. "If you don't comply, we'll sue," she snapped. I smiled faintly. "Go ahead. I've got a lawyer, documents, and ownership. What do you have?" The room erupted in whispers. Talia stood, saying loudly, "I'm with Darius. Margaret fined me once over a flower pot, but she never touches her friend's violations." A few voices chimed in support. Margaret looked around, panicking, then shot up, gathering her papers. "This meeting's adjourned," she yelled, storming out, her heels echoing on the floor. I stood there, watching her go, relief flooding through me. Marcus called me. "I just double-checked," he said over the phone. "Margaret's lease on 1801 expires in 5 days. Want to renew it?" I smirked. "No way. She wanted me out. Now she'll get a taste of being evicted." Marcus laughed. "Fair enough. I'll send the termination notice today. She's got 30 days to move out, per the law." I nodded, satisfaction rising. I'm not big on revenge, but Margaret forced my hand, and I wasn't about to go easy. A few days later, Coming home from work, I saw Margaret in the lobby with an older man, probably her husband, Robert Hensley. They were talking to Henry Caldwell, Margaret's voice, sharp but hushed. I slowed my pace, pretending to check my phone, and heard her say, "We want to negotiate to buy the unit. He can't kick me out after 20 years here." Caldwell shrugged. "You need to talk to Darius. He's the legal owner." I smiled to myself, stepped forward, and said, "I heard that. Anything I can help with?" Margaret spun around, face red. Robert, a tall thin man with salt and pepper hair, cleared his throat. "We'd like to buy 1801, he said, his voice low but shaky. "Fair price." I raised an eyebrow. "What's fair?" Margaret jumped in, her tone biting. "The same you paid for it, no more." I laughed. "That's not how real estate works. I inherited this unit, and now it's mine. If you want it, pay market value, $400,000, plus the $4,000 in HOA fees you owe." Margaret glared, fists clenched. $400,000. "That's robbery," she yelled. I shrugged. "Don't like it. Find somewhere else to live. Your lease is up, and I'm not renewing. You've got 30 days. Robert sighed, rubbing his forehead, but Margaret wouldn't back down. "I'll sue you," she snarled. "I've got more right to be here than you." I met her gaze, voice calm. "Go ahead and sue. I've got a lawyer, documents, and ownership. What do you have besides threats?" She didn't answer, just turned away, dragging Robert with her. I watched them leave the lobby, knowing it wouldn't be the last I'd hear from her. But then, about a week later, I heard noise from the 18th floor, late one night. I peeked over my balcony, and saw a few people hauling stuff from 1801 into a small moving truck at the entrance. I spotted Margaret's figure, wrapped in a long coat, quietly directing without a word. They moved out in the dead of night. No goodbye. No scene like I'd expected. I stood there, watching the truck vanish into the streetlights, relief washing over me. The next morning, I checked with Caldwell in the lobby. He confirmed, "They're gone." Margaret said she didn't want to stay where she's no longer respected. I nodded, smiling. Silverstone Towers suddenly felt calmer. The HOA started shifting gears. Caldwell said the board was reviewing rules, focusing on building maintenance instead of nitpicking residents. I began to feel the peace I'd dreamed of when I moved here. Not because everything was suddenly perfect, but because I'd proven I belonged. I wasn't the outsider Margaret tried to make me. I was Darius Jackson, tenant, heir, and now part of this community. A few days after Margaret left, I decided to do something I'd put off for too long. Throw a small party. I'm not big on noise, but I wanted to thank the people who'd backed me through this. I invited Talia Brooks, Henry Caldwell, and a few other residents I'd started chatting with post-HOA meeting. I set out some sandwich trays, opened a bottle of wine, and played light music in the apartment. As people arrived, I saw genuine smiles, no more awkwardness or avoidance. Talia brought a plate of cookies, grinning. "I know it's late, but welcome to Silverstone Towers." I laughed. "Better late than never," I replied, sipping my wine. Caldwell showed up too, looking more at ease without Margaret hovering. He sat on the couch, saying the board was overhauling the HOA rules. "We'll focus on fixing elevators and maintaining the pool," he said, not measuring every curtain. I nodded, glad to see the change I'd helped spark. A few other residents, ones who'd stayed quiet while Margaret targeted me, came too. They offered hesitant apologies like, "We didn't know it was that bad," or "We just didn't want trouble." I didn't hold it against them. I got it. Sometimes people stay silent out of fear, but now they were speaking up, and that was enough for me. As the party wound down, I stepped onto the balcony, standing alone, gazing at Charlotte's twinkling lights in the distance. I thought about my journey at Silverstone Towers, from that first excited day, to weeks of Margaret's harassment, to the showdown at the HOA meeting. I remembered how she'd looked at me, like I didn't deserve to be here, and how I'd stayed calm even when I wanted to yell. I didn't win because of papers or ownership. I won because I didn't let her define who I was. Margaret thought she could use rules and power to push me out, but she didn't get that. Real strength comes from knowing who you are, and not letting anyone take that away. I thought about Eleanor Grayson, the aunt I never met. I wondered if she knew her legacy would help me like this. I picked up her photo from the wooden box, looking at that gentle smile, and felt an odd connection. She'd left me more than apartments. She'd given me a chance to stand firm against people like Margaret. I whispered, "Thanks, Eleanor," and set the photo on the shelf next to the little cactus pot Margaret once hated. Silverstone Towers isn't perfect. There are still some averted glances, small cracks in how this community runs, but it's changing. Talia started talking to me more. Caldwell occasionally asked my input on building upkeep, and I felt like I truly belonged. I sipped the last of my coffee, looked out at the city, and smiled. The story I just recounted. HOA Karen tries to ban new tenant, unaware he's the heir to her condo, mirrors many real aspects of life in the US today, especially in apartment complexes, or neighborhoods with homeowners associations, HOAs. In America, HOAs often exist to maintain living standards, but sometimes they become tools for power trips or prejudice, like how Margaret Hensley targeted Darius Jackson, because he was new, and maybe didn't fit her self-imposed standards. This reflects the subtle discrimination, still lingering in modern American society, where some wield petty authority to impose their will, especially on minorities like Darius, a black man. His inheritance from Eleanor Grayson, and using it to flip the script, also highlights how legal knowledge and property rights are powerful weapons in the US system, where the law protects those who understand and leverage it. The takeaway from this story for real life in America is stay patient, know your rights, and build allies, instead of letting emotions drive you when facing injustice. Darius didn't lash out despite Margaret's barrage of warnings about his bike, blinds, or eviction threats. Instead, he quietly gathered evidence, photos of others' violations, and waited for the right moment to strike back at the HOA meeting. He also connected with Talia and Marcus, building community and legal strength to counter Margaret. In today's America, where social tensions and personal disputes can flare up fast, this lesson encourages keeping cool, learning the rules like Darius, with Eleanor's will, and using relationships, like the final party, to overcome challenges. Don't let the Margarets define you. Use knowledge and persistence to claim your place, like Darius did at Silverstone Towers. If you enjoyed my journey at Silverstone Towers, and how I outmaneuvered Margaret Hensley, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss more exciting stories. Thanks for following along, and see you in the next video, with even more surprising life lessons.